Hello, everyone. My name is Tzipi Horowitz-Kraus. I'm a faculty member at the Educational Neuroimaging Group at the Technion in Israel and also in the Neuropsychology Department at Kennedy Krieger Institute and the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. I'm a neuroscientist, specializes in reading and reading development, and I'm providing this background for reading and reading development as part of my research fellowship at the LEAP Challenge, MIT Solve and Jacobs Foundation, as part of our project that focused on Bookbot. So without further ado, let's move on. And let's talk about, first of all, the real challenge. We are interested to make sure that every child has the tool to acquire reading, to understand the written materials, and to enjoy reading, because as we know, that books are the fountain of knowledge. It is not easy to read. It's not an intuitive process. We often use neuroimaging data to kind of emphasize, both educators and professionals, also parents and families, how challenging it is for the young brain to acquire reading. You can see the image here to your right when you see an illustration inspired by Stanislav Dehaene's studies, looking at the different brain regions related to reading. And you see that in order to be able to read, the brain has to engage brain regions that were not originally developed to read, such as visual processing regions here in red, and language-related regions here in orange, and also in green related to phonological processing, as well as for the articulation of the actual words here in blue. This image represents the difficulty in engaging several brain regions that have to be active together simultaneously to be able to read fluently and to comprehend the written material. How's it really accomplished? Why won't we start from the beginning? So we have several reading models that aim to explain how children acquire the foundations for reading. And this is one of the famous ones from Cho from 1983, so back in the days, and she's trying to explain what are the main processes in the reading acquisition phases. And we see that we can break the reading process into two main parts. The first part here in blue is the learning to read phase. And the second phase is the reading to learn, which is the purpose of reading. We will focus here on the first phase, the learning to read process, where we see that even literacy seed, even the exposure to books and the understanding that these shapes, the letters, have some sort of a meaning in the spoken language, which is the sounds in spoken language, and then the words that have semantic meaning in the spoken language are acquired even before 6 years old. So even before the official age that the child is entering school and learns how to read. It is then moved to the decoding phase that happens officially at first, second grades, where the child explicitly been taught the principles, the alphabetical principles, so that one letter corresponds with one sound, or even more, depends on the location of the letter in the word. This is not an intuitive process. It has to be taught explicitly. For some children, they just get it really fast and automatically, but for some, it takes a longer time. It's a longer process. But this process is acquired approximately the first, second grades. And then once the child is exposed to the same words or to different words with the same sounds, and read it again and again and understand the meaning of these words, then the expectation is that the word itself will become part of the child's mental lexicon. In other words, that the child, when the child is encounter this word, he or she will not have to decode each letter and sound again and again, but will be able to read it as a whole, holistically, which means that it is expected that in this second phase, the child will be able to read the words orthographically. Once the child acquires an orthographic mental lexicon, so a bank of words that the child is able to read holistically, then when the words are within a context, so when the child gets sentences and texts and paragraphs, then the expectation is that the child is able to read these words automatically in a context which leads the child to the second phase of fluent reading. So the ability to read words holistically in a context while understanding the meaning of the words and the meaning of the context. When the child is doing that, then the mental resources, so different cognitive resources that we all use, but are heavily used in the reading process, such as attention and memory and inhibition, our ability to inhibit our impulses. All these cognitive abilities are then able to be allocated towards reading comprehension, which is stage 3 and on. As you see, stages 3, 4, 5 are really about gaining knowledge from print, whereas in the first phases, 0 to 3, the idea is that the child acquires the building blocks for reading. So let's just focus on these 3 first stages for a while. So there are several models that aim to explain the technical process of reading, the first phases that we talked about earlier from Scholl's model. And one of the famous ones is the simple view of reading model that kind of tries to explain, okay, so what are the building blocks for reading acquisition? And as you see here, the model emphasizes the importance of language processing, which is the ability to understand language, both auditorily, so narrative comprehension, as well as semantic meaning and vocabulary. So without the ability to understand language, to understand the meaning of the words, even in spoken language, it is basically impossible to move on to the next phase, which is the decoding process, the matching of the sounds to the letters and the orthographic reading, the holistic orthographic reading that we talked about earlier. So to accomplish reading comprehension, which is a really end goal of the reading process, we have to make sure that the child understand the words, even in spoken language, and that will somehow serve as a scaffold for the semantic meaning that will then be matched to the words that the child tries to decode. As you see here, the boxes for the different reading components are colored in a specific color that corresponds to this brain image that you see here to your right. So all these subcomponents for reading really decode and correspond, to specific brain regions that are related to these basic abilities, and kind of emphasizes how challenging it is and how not intuitive it is to be able to read. Well, down the road, several studies, extensive research in the field realized that there is a missing component here in the simple view of reading model, which is reading fluency. Because if the child understands the meaning of the words in the spoken language, is this component, language processing component, and knows how to decode, and even knows how to recognize words holistically, well, if this process is not done in an automatic manner, meaning that it is not a labored process anymore. It's an automatic, speeded, accurate process. Then it will be very challenging to the child, as I said earlier, to allocate cognitive resources like attention and working memory, our ability to manipulate sounds and language, which is critical in the reading process, as well as inhibition and speed of processing and more. The child will not be allocated all of those to reading comprehension. And there are other models in the reading literature explaining how important it is to release these cognitive processes for the benefit of reading comprehension. Because we all know that if we are super disturbed and our attention is allocated somewhere else, we can decode the words and we can read very accurate, but we will not understand anything at the end of the sentence. We'll have to go back to the sentence. This is exactly what's happening when a child is learning to read. And we want to make sure that reading is automatic, that the child understands the meaning of the words that the child is reading, recognize the words automatically in a text, i.e., reads the text fluently. And then reading comprehension will be achieved. So several studies, as I said, recognize this gap in the literature, such as Silverman and one of our recently published reviews, pointing at the need to include reading fluency as an official part of the reading model, of the simple view of reading model. And again, corresponding to these brain regions here at the right. And down the road, there were additional reading models that kind of try to say, hey, these two components are not unrelated to each other. Language comprehension is critical, or language processing is critical for reading, because we want to make sure that the child gets the meaning, not just that the child decodes, right? It's important to understand the meaning of the words. It is important, obviously, to know how to decode the words, decode the letters and then the words and automatically recognize them. But there is an interaction between these two components. And this interaction leads to fluent reading and reading comprehension. So these are the most, it's called the rope model. This is one of the well-known models that are built on the simple view of reading model. And again, corresponding to different brain regions, which led researchers in 2020, Kim Young and her beautiful model representing the reading process, or maybe the simple view of reading process in a house, in the shape of a house, saying that, as we said, there are building blocks, there are very basic components for reading, and you see the word reading and the listening comprehension piece that we saw also earlier in the simple view of reading model and also in the rope model. But these two components that are super critical also rely on emergence literacy, so really the exposure, understanding of the importance of literacy, and the exposure of children to home literacy environment, and the intact phonological processing mechanism. So the ability of the child to recognize the tiny little sounds in language, and to make sure that the child is able to differentiate them. And then the language processing and cognitive abilities processes that are also really at the bottom of this house graph. And the basic foundations for everything is cognitive abilities or executive functions, which is the inhibition and attention and working memory abilities that we talked about, even speed of processing, that are super critical for everything that comes on top of it. Then, when all these components are active intactly, then reading fluency arrives, which you see it here. And when the child is able to recognize words holistically, to understand the meaning of the words here, have intact attention resources to allocate to higher order processes, and understand also the syntax and the structure of the specific language that is being taught, then reading fluency is achieved. So reading is automatic, accurate, speeded manner, and the child understands the narrative, understands the context of the sentence or the text. And only then reading comprehension, the ability to tease out information from written material, the ability to construct new thoughts and new conclusions from the materials is being achieved. And I want to make sure that it is very clear that reading these processes that I just talked about are super critical to allow every child, wherever the child is, to enjoy reading, to see the book as a fountain of knowledge, just as I said earlier. If we go back to Dr. Seuss, one of the famous quotes, the more that you read, the more things you will know. The more that you learn, the more places you go. And really reading comprehension, the ability to comprehend what's written in the text can take the child to different places in history or even in the future. I would like to thank you for your attention, and I hope that you learned some more about the process of reading and reading fluency. Thank you.